One of air power's principal and oldest roles in war is direct support of the ground forces. Nowhere in recent times was air power's effectiveness in this task better illustrated than during the 1991 Gulf War. Here, the 5-week air campaign literally cleared the way for the ground offensive. The campaign so reduced the combat efficiency of the Iraqi forces in Kuwait that the coalition ground offensive achieved its aim in a mere 4 days, with the very minimum of casualties. Air power has clearly defined roles within the ground theatre of operations. First of all, it provides strategic airlift to deploy troops and equipment to the theatre. It also employs tactical airlift, usually with helicopters within the combat zone itself. Reconnaissance aircraft, like the Lockheed U-2, are an invaluable source of intelligence. There is also offensive air support. This operates partially in the rear of the combat zone, using its long arm to disrupt the enemy's supply system. It also provides close support to the troops locked in combat in the front line.
Please drop cluster bombs for personnel, approximately a platoon-size element, 500 meters due north of my location. Be over. 500.
Okay, understand that due north of your location. And I'm going to drop a bomb about 1,000 meters north of your position.
Roger that.
Make sure he understands this is cluster bombs. This is danger close.
That's fine. We got bombs away now.
Negative.
Target, open target. Good job.
Hey, guard, keep your head down. We got some more coming in.
Roger that.
Many of these roles were evolved during the Great War of 1914-18. They were perfected during the Second World War. The oldest form of military aviation is that of reconnaissance. It was in this role that the aircraft first went to war. During 1914-18, the art of photographic air reconnaissance was developed. The photographs themselves were primarily used to update maps, but a generation later, air photography would reach a high level of sophistication. Well before the outbreak of war in 1939, both sides had indulged in clandestine air photography, sometimes using civil airliners. The British, concerned over Hitler's military buildup, wanted to monitor German armaments factories and military installations. The problem was that the lenses of existing cameras fogged up at heights above 8,000 feet. but to fly lower than this would be bound to excite German attention. Fred Winterbottom, a member of British Air Intelligence, found a solution. He approached the American Lockheed Company and purchased 3 of their Electras, the aircraft used by Amelia Earhart in her fatal 1937 round-the-world flight. Winterbottom had one of these equipped with German Leica cameras, used for bird watching. He handed it over to Australian explorer and pilot Sidney Cotton, who set up an aviation consultancy company as a front. In this way, during the spring and summer of 1939, Cotton was able to overfly Italy and Germany and take air photographs on the pretext of visiting air shows to drum up business. When war broke out in September 1939, Cotton's services were retained by the Royal Air Force. They soon found that the Bristol Blenheim bombers, which were being used for photographic air reconnaissance, were too slow and vulnerable. Cotton therefore proposed converting some Spitfires, the RAF's top fighter. Stripped of all armament and even its radios, the photographic reconnaissance Spitfire flew at 30,000 feet and more. This, and its speed, enabled it to evade hostile fighters. Even so, the pilots of the PR Spitfires faced special challenges as they flew over hostile territory to probe the enemy's secrets.
The lack of radio or any kind of navigation facilities other than a simple map made long flights over cloud particularly hazardous. Occasionally you'd be over cloud for the whole of the outward and return journeys. And with crosswinds up to 100 miles an hour, you frequently had little idea where you were when you finally broke through the cloud.
The Germans also recognized that high altitude was the PR aircraft's main security. Their Junkers Ju-86P had a pressurized cabin and was able to fly even higher than the PR Spitfire. When America entered the war at the end of 1941, a special photographic reconnaissance group was sent to Europe. It was commanded by Elliott Roosevelt, second son of the President of the United States. He was well qualified for the job, having had extensive experience in air survey and mapping. Roosevelt's group was made up of specially adapted P-38 Lightnings, as well as B-17 bombers. They soon proved themselves, especially in missions connected with the Anglo-American landings in French Northwest Africa in November 1942. Indeed, Elliott Roosevelt's contribution to the success of the campaign was officially recognized by the award of the Distinguished Flying Cross. But not all air photography was carried out at high altitude. If the object of interest was a single piece of equipment, the PR aircraft had to go in at very low level, something that took considerable nerve and skill on the part of the pilot. One example was photographs taken in early 1942 of a new type of German radar near the French Channel coast. A subsequent airborne operation succeeded in bringing parts of it back to Britain for technical evaluation, enabling counters to the radar to be developed. But taking good photographs was only part of the story. Once they'd been processed, the images on them had to be interpreted. The key tool in this was the stereoscope, which gave the images a 3D appearance. One of the most skilled photographic interpreters was Briton Constance Babington Smith. Her sharp eyes and intuitive brain unveiled a number of German secrets, including the Me-163 Comet rocket plane.
Taken off Peenemünde in spring of 1943. There were 3 of these strange little tailless aircraft. And then subsequently I saw several more of them there, and it was at Peenemünde I first saw the marks which the rocket exhaust made by scorching the grass before the plane took off.
Peenemünde itself was the secret German experimental weapons establishment and was situated on the Baltic coast. It was here that Constance Babington Smith also spotted that the Germans were conducting trials of the V-1 flying bomb.
When you're looking through a stereoscope, you really feel you are on the ground, and I followed this road down to the edge of the area, and there were 3 structures of a kind that I'd never seen before, and it seemed to me they were the sort of structure you would need if you were going to launch an aircraft or something else out to sea. You see from the shadow that they're at an angle, you can tell they're sloping, and on the central one here, this tiny little smudge linked up with the small aircraft I'd already seen, and measuring it with my measuring magnifier, I could tell that the span was just 20 feet. In other words, this was the evidence we had been waiting for. Here was the midget aircraft on a ramp, a launching ramp. It was known to us then as the Peenemünde 20. Later, of course, it was known to a great many more people as the V-1.
Hitler's V-1 offensive against Britain was delayed until June 1944 by the RAF bombing of Peenemünde, by which time the Allies were firmly ashore in Normandy. Air photographic reconnaissance was a priceless intelligence tool. But if it operated in a shadowy and secret environment, the opposite was true for close air support, the use of offensive air power on the land battlefield itself. Ground strafing, as many pilots called it, was developed on the Western Front during 1914-18. By 1939, with radio communications very much more sophisticated than they'd been 20 years before, close air support had the potential to be very much more responsive and flexible. The German General Heinz Guderian was one of the first to recognize this. He was one of the leading exponents of armored warfare and a developer of blitzkrieg, or lightning war, which enabled the Germans to overrun so much of Europe during 1939-41. It was during the Polish campaign, when he was commanding a panzer corps, that Guderian identified the secret to effective close air support. This was to have an Air Force officer with a radio as part of his headquarters. In this way, aircraft could be summoned quickly to help deal with obstinate enemy resistance. The Germans also possessed a superlative close support aircraft in the Junkers Ju-87 Stuka dive bomber. This usually carried a 500-pound bomb under its belly and 4 smaller bombs attached to its wings. It had a crew of 2, pilot and gunner. To make an attack, the pilot would put his plane into a near vertical dive and pull up as he released his bombs. These could be delivered with almost pinpoint accuracy onto the target, and the Stuka was also fitted with a siren, the scream of which was often enough to make the stoutest heart quake. One of the Stuka's most spectacular actions was in the forcing of the River Meuse during the invasion of France in May 1940. Here they totally demoralized the French defenders on the home bank. One survivor of this attack recalled,
"The noise, the horrible noise. You feel the bomb coming, even if it falls 50 or 100 meters away. You throw yourself to the ground certain of being blown into 30 pieces. And when you realize it was only a miss, the noise of this shrieking drives you to breaking point."
By the time the Germans invaded Russia in June 1941, cooperation between the Stukas and the panzer formations had developed into a fine art. Indeed, when advancing across the open steppe, the tank commanders didn't have to use their maps. They merely headed for the explosions of the Stuka's bombs. In contrast, early Allied Army cooperation aircraft, like the British Westland Lysander, lacked the weaponry and performance to contribute much to the land battle. But this would change. During their campaign against the Axis forces in North Africa, the British and Americans adapted fighters for the ground attack role. Among them were the British Beaufighter, the American-designed Curtiss P-40 Warhawk, and the P-38 Lightning. The Russians, on the other hand, produced the tailor-made Ilyushin IL-2 and later IL-10 Stormoviks. So vital did the Red Army consider these aircraft that Stalin told aircraft production workers that Stormoviks were needed as much as air and bread. They were very tough aircraft, which could take much punishment. The Stormovik often attacked at such low level that it could engage targets horizontally. The Germans had a healthy respect for them, calling them Black Death. During the campaigns in Europe, the Americans used versions of the A-20 Boston Havoc day bomber for close air support. There was also the rugged and powerful P-47 Thunderbolt, which could carry a wide variety of weapon mixes and could operate happily from rough airstrips. Tanks became a key target for ground attack aircraft. To deal with them, the Germans fitted a 30mm cannon pod to the underside of ground attack aircraft like the Henschel HS-129 and Ju-87. In the hands of a skilled pilot, this proved to be a remarkably accurate weapons system. The Western Allies turned to rockets, which could be used against all manner of targets. This was especially in Normandy during the summer of 1944, when British Typhoons and American Thunderbolts were frequently in action with them. During the Allied breakout from Normandy in early August 1944, the Germans mounted an armored counterstroke. wave upon wave of rocket-firing aircraft attacked the German tanks and broke up the assault. Later inspection of the tanks revealed that few had been actually damaged by the rockets. The crews had merely been so demoralized by the attacks that they had fled their vehicles. Both the Americans and the British used their heavy bombers in the close support role in Normandy to soften up the German defenses prior to an attack. The sight of the massed bomber formations in the sky above did much to raise the morale of the troops on the ground. But the bombers proved to be a two-edged weapon. Carpet bombing, as it was called, certainly concussed the defenders for a time, but it also caused casualties to friendly troops on more than one occasion. Furthermore, it churned up the ground so much that it made it difficult for the attackers, especially tanks, to move forward. In contrast, some of the close air support provided by carrier aircraft during the American assaults on Japanese-held islands in the Pacific was remarkable for its accuracy. Aircraft often struck at Japanese positions less than 100 yards from the American front line. The German practice of positioning Air Force officers with radios well forward was soon followed by the Allies, who called them air tentacles. At the higher level, the basic question was whether the control of close air support sorties should be centralized or be parceled out to the various ground formations. It's a debate that continues to rage among Air Force and Army officers to this day. During the latter half of World War II, the Allies centralized. Spotting a frontline target, the frontline commander would pass a request for air support to his formation HQ. This, in turn, would pass it to the air tentacle, which would refer it to the Army Air Support Center at Army HQ. This would consider it in the light of the Army commander's concept of operations. If approved, it would be passed to the Air Force HQ, with the target details being given to the Army liaison officer at the airfield involved. He would brief the crews, and they would then take off and attack. In Normandy, however, such was the overwhelming Allied air supremacy that an abbreviated system operated. Ground attack aircraft circled over the battlefield like cabs waiting for a fare. Indeed, it was called the cab rank. A target request by the forward troops would be handled by the air tentacle, which would call in available aircraft by radio. Close air support was increasingly valued by armies during 1939-45, to the extent that if they could not see their own aircraft overhead, morale would drop. One Free French officer, after a desperate battle against the Germans in Tunisia, vowed that he would, if he had a daughter, call her Tentacule. Such was his gratitude for the close air support he'd been given. But other offensive air support was less obvious to the frontline soldier, but equally as critical. At dawn on the 1st of September 1939, German air bases near the border with Poland were a hive of activity, as an armada of aircraft prepared to take off. Among the pilots was an Me-109 squadron commander, Adolf Galland.
It was still dark on the morning of the 1st of September 1939 as we climbed into our cockpits. Blue flames spurted from the exhausts of our engines as they warmed up, and at the first signs of dawn the fireworks started. The targets for our unit were Polish staff headquarters and barracks. The spirit of the Polish army was to all intents and purposes broken on this first day of the campaign.
This was a crucial element of the German blitzkrieg strategy, the use of air power to dislocate the enemy's command, control, and communications at the outset. Thus he would be even less able to react in time to the rapier-like incisions of the fast-moving panzer formations. Allied to this was interdiction, attacks against the lines of communication to disrupt the flow of supplies and reinforcements. The Luftwaffe concentrated on this after the first day of the Polish campaign, attacking railways, roads, and bridges. This was a major reason why Poland was overrun so quickly. When Hitler invaded France and the Low Countries in May 1940, the Luftwaffe employed a new tactic: attacks on refugees, in order to clog up the roads and hinder the Allied withdrawal. Allied attempts at interdiction in France were costly, with some 50 of these Fairey battle light bombers being lost, especially in attempts to destroy the German bridges over the River Meuse. It was, however, during the last year of the war in Europe that interdiction was pursued on a wide scale. In the spring of 1944, the Allies were deadlocked in Italy. They had failed to break through the formidable German defense system, the Gustav Line. An attempt to do so by outflanking it with an amphibious landing at Anzio in January had stalled. The Allied air forces therefore mounted Operation Strangle. This was designed to make it impossible for the Germans to hold the Gustav Line through major disruption of their lines of communication. Normal ground attack types like the Lightning and Thunderbolt were backed up with heavy and medium bombers. The Allied aircraft concentrated particularly on bridges. Railways and railway trains were also targets. Even so, it was not until the second half of May that the Allied forces were able, after much hard fighting, to force the Germans to withdraw from the Gustav Line. On the 5th of June 1944, they entered Rome, but much hard fighting lay ahead. Simultaneously, a more successful interdiction operation had been mounted in preparation for the June 1944 cross-channel invasion. From late April, the Allied air forces, helped by the French resistance, struck at all road and rail links leading into Normandy. This was primarily to prevent the Germans from rushing in reinforcements, especially panzer divisions, once the landings took place. This air campaign was highly successful. Continually harried from the air, the panzer reinforcements were forced to use their own tracks instead of the railways, and took literally days to reach Normandy. Throughout the Normandy campaign, Allied aircraft continued their interdiction role, making it almost impossible for German supplies and reinforcements to move on the roads during daylight. The climax came in August 1944, when withdrawing German forces were trapped at Falaise and pounded from the air, suffering indescribable carnage. A modern parallel was the destruction of the Iraqi forces fleeing northwards from Kuwait City on the so-called Highway of Death during the 1991 Gulf War. The 1939-45 equivalent to today's helicopter-borne air-mobile forces were the airborne troops. The parachute was one method of deploying these troops to the battlefield. Paratroops were first used in war by the Germans during their invasion of Norway in April 1940. The following month, they were employed during the attack on Holland. In the light of the German successes, both the Americans and the British raised their own parachute forces. They were used as a spearhead in the majority of the major Allied amphibious operations in the European theatre. But paratroops were very vulnerable to enemy fire until they landed on the ground. It was also not possible in those days to drop heavy weapons by parachute. This meant that the paratroops could not hold out for very long on their own. One solution to this was the glider, which could carry light tanks and guns. Again, the Germans pioneered this form of military air transport. One of the most spectacular German uses of the glider was in the rescue of fallen Italian dictator Benito Mussolini in September 1943. He was imprisoned in a mountain hotel, and the only way that he could be reached was by glider. the gliders made a perfect landing, taking Mussolini's guards totally by surprise. A group then entered the hotel and brought Mussolini to safety. It was the Germans who built what was the largest glider of all time, the Messerschmitt Me-321, aptly named the Gigant. This could carry 200 troops, or their equivalent in heavy weapons. But getting the Gigant into the air was a problem. This was even with the use of rocket-assisted takeoff. One idea for a tug aircraft was two Heinkel HE-111 bombers welded together and called the Zwilling, or twin. Another was to have three Messerschmitt Me-110s flying in tandem. This, however, was fraught with danger, as leading German test pilot Hannah Reitsch describes.
We had 6 rockets on the wing, which when they once were blowing, you could not stop them. So when you lost one towing bomber, also the right bomber was lost. I was hanging on one bomber that was like a little fly compared with my giant. And all 6 rockets were burning. I knew I couldn't stop it. I could get 150 feet high. Then the rockets were finished after 3 minutes or 4. And I knew the single tow bomber had to release me, otherwise he would.
The 110 did release, and Hannah Reitsch managed to get her Gigant safely back on the ground. But the experience totally disillusioned her.
I finished because I was so much against it, because it was too big.
Even so, some 200 Gigants were built. The Allies too developed gliders, like the British Horsa. And the American Waco, but these were more modest in size. Among the operations in which they took part was the last major airborne operation of the war in Europe, that in support of the crossings of the River Rhine in March 1945. The gliders and their tugs had to fly through a heavy barrage of flak. But the glider pilots faced their real challenge once they'd been released by the tug aircraft. For landing a glider safely and in the right place called not only for a high degree of pilot skill, but also luck. Often this was absent, and casualties to the gliders and their occupants were frequently high. The other way to reinforce paratroops from the air was by bringing in troops by transport aircraft. The Germans used this method in both Norway and Holland, with the paratroops first securing an airfield. Seizing an airfield was crucial and was the immediate priority during the spectacular German airborne invasion of the eastern Mediterranean island of Crete in May 1941. Mistakes by the British enabled the paratroops to capture an airfield at almost their last gasp. Such had been their casualties. The landing of reinforcements immediately turned the tide in their favor, and the island quickly fell. Air resupply could be invaluable in maintaining a fast-moving advance. Thus, when the Allied forces moved into Tunisia from Algeria after the Anglo-American landings in French Northwest Africa in November 1942, C-47 transports ran a shuttle service, bringing in fuel, food and ammunition to forward airfields. Air resupply was also used after the breakout from Normandy in August 1944. When the Allied advance became so rapid that the leading elements began to outrun their fuel supplies. In the end, however, it was not enough to keep the fuel tanks full, and the advance ground to a halt. Air resupply also failed in dramatic fashion on the Eastern Front. The German 6th Army had spent the late summer and autumn of 1942 battling to capture the city of Stalingrad astride the river Volga. A sudden Russian counter-offensive then cut it off from the remainder of the German forces. Luftwaffe Commander-in-Chief Hermann Göring declared that his aircraft could keep the Germans in Stalingrad supplied. Friedrich Paulus, commanding the 6th Army, was therefore ordered to hold on rather than break out. But to maintain his combat effectiveness, he needed 750 tons of supplies per day. At very best, the available German transport aircraft could provide less than 1/3 of this. Worse, in mid-December, further Russian attacks drove the main German forces back to 125 miles from Stalingrad, making the flight to the city twice as long and even more perilous. As the perimeter of the Stalingrad pocket shrank under increasing Russian pressure, so one airfield after another within it fell. Still, the Ju-52s kept coming. But by mid-January 1943, such had been their losses that a bare 40 tons per day were being delivered, much of this falling into Russian hands. Finally, on the last day of January, Paulus surrendered. Göring's proud boast had proved to be an empty one. In contrast, Burma and elsewhere in Southeast Asia saw the Allied forces fighting the Japanese in the jungle successfully maintained by air. In particular, the operations of one American Army Air Force unit stand out. This was No. 1 Air Commando, led by the youthful Colonel Phil Cochrane. His mission was to support the Chindits, a force conceived and led by Briton Ord Wingate, in a lengthy operation deep behind the Japanese lines in Burma to disrupt their communications. Cochrane's aircraft and gliders not only initially landed the Chindits in makeshift airstrips, but then kept them supplied, as well as flying out sick and wounded. The China-Burma-India theatre also witnessed the use of strategic air resupply. After the Japanese invaded China in 1937, a road was constructed so that munitions sent by the United States could be shipped to the Burma port of Rangoon and then taken up to the new Chinese seat of government at Chungking. When the Japanese invaded and overran Burma in early 1942, the Burma Road, as it was called, was closed, but China still desperately needed aid. Consequently, a massive airlift was organized from India. The mountains which separate India from China produced turbulent weather, and flying the hump, as it was called, needed skill and courage. As one pilot recalled,
"Flying the hump in bad weather was the most hazardous assignment a flight crew could draw, more dangerous than combat. More cargo planes were lost over the hump than combat planes fighting against the Japanese. During the hump operation, over 600 planes and 1,000 crewmen were lost. Our route was called the Aluminum Trail."
Yet the crews, American and British, continued to fly the route for 2.5 years, and their efforts did much to help China continue to resist the Japanese. Eventually, in early 1945, after American and Chinese forces had built a new road running from Ledo near the Indian border and fought their way through northern Burma, the Burma Road was reopened and the pressure came off the transport crews. At the other end of the scale, light aircraft like the German Fieseler Storch enabled commanders to move quickly about the combat zone. Another willing workhorse was the American L-4 Grasshopper. This was used for reconnaissance, evacuating wounded, and for directing artillery fire. There was, however, one further use of air power, one that was so secret that few knew about it until after the war was over. This was the employment of aircraft to insert and extract the brave men and women who operated as agents in enemy-occupied countries. Besides using parachutes, the agents were sometimes actually landed and picked up by aircraft under the very noses of the Germans. The Lockheed Hudson, which for its size had a surprisingly short takeoff and landing distance, was one aircraft employed in this work. Another was the smaller British Westland Lysander, known to its pilots as the Lizzie. This proved much better suited to this work than it had in its original role as an Army cooperation aircraft. When the distinguished French soldier Marshal Ferdinand Foch witnessed an air display in 1910, he remarked, "That's good sport, but for the Army, the airplane is of no use." Yet, a little over a generation later, air power played its part in every aspect of the war on land during 1939-45. Without its support, armies were unlikely to achieve victory. Air power had become indispensable.